Hello, friends, and welcome to the February 9th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about policy issues here in our great state and have a conversation about how you can engage in that process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and we have an exciting episode for you today as we welcome Christina Das to the program. Christina is an attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund and is here to talk with us about election protection efforts with a special emphasis on minority voters in East Texas. We'll also be joined by Elizabeth Bille with NALEO to discuss voting rights and civic engagement in Latino communities. And we'll open the episode with the return of one of your favorite segments, The Weekly Word, with a good friend and Texas Impact board member, Rabbi Nancy Kasten. Rabbi Kasten wears so many hats, but among them is that of Chief Relationship Officer with Faith Commons in Dallas. But before we get to the program, I want to share a couple of quick thoughts at the top. First, thanks to all who reached out to share your thoughts on the relaunch of Weekly Witness this week. This is another reminder that this is your podcast, and we are itching to hear from you with questions or thoughts about the new format. I'd love to hear from you at scott@texasimpact.org. And help us out by subscribing, sharing, and inviting a friend to listen. But today, I want to focus on the upcoming election. This is our second in a series of 3 episodes focused on elections. So, spoiler, that means we think this is important. Early voting begins Monday, March 14th and runs through Friday, February 25th before Election Day, March 1st. And y'all, I don't know what else to say. At least I won't after we finish this series of podcasts. But before we jump into the conversation, I want to again stress that 95% of Texas elections are typically decided in the primary. Odds are that the people who will be representing you for the next 2 to 4 years will be decided in the next few weeks or months. So spend some time, research the candidates, and organize your friends. This is important. Your communities, neighbors, and democracy needs you. So listen, take notes, and then get moving. So with that, here we go. The Weekly Word with Rabbi Nancy Kasten.
Rabbi Joachim Prinz immigrated to the United States from Germany in 1937 and became a leader in the civil rights movement. In 1963, Prinz spoke at the March on Washington, in between Mahalia Jackson and Martin Luther King. While I would substitute some of the terms and pronouns that date his speech, I share his words because I cannot think of a better message to repeat today, almost 60 years later. He said, "I speak to you as an American Jew. As Americans, we share the profound concern of millions of people about the shame and disgrace of inequality and injustice, which make a mockery of the great American idea. As Jews, we bring to this great demonstration in which thousands of us proudly participate a twofold experience, one of the Spirit and one of our history. In the realm of the Spirit, our fathers taught us thousands of years ago that when God created man, he created him as everybody's neighbor. Neighbor is not a geographic term. It is a moral concept. It means our collective responsibility for the preservation of man's dignity and integrity. When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned under those tragic circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people, which had created a great civilization, had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder. America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent. Not merely Black America, but all of America. It must speak up and act, from the president down to the humblest of us, and not for the sake of the Negro, not for the sake of the Black community, but for the sake of the image, the idea, and the aspiration of America itself. Our children, yours and mine, in every school across the land, each morning pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States and to the republic for which it stands. They, the children, speak fervently and innocently of this land as the land of liberty and justice for all. The time, I believe, has come to work together, for it is not enough to hope together, and it is not enough to pray together. To work together, that this children's oath, proclaimed every morning from Maine to California, from north to south, may become a glorious, unshakable reality in a morally renewed and united America. For Jews and other communities of faith, the work that calls us in this moment, in 2022, is the work of making it possible for every eligible citizen to vote in democratic elections, knowing that their vote will be counted and not disputed. There are multiple ways to do this work, but all of us are needed to serve as educators and role models, as volunteer deputy registrars and election poll workers, as voter rights advocates with our elected officials, as letter writers, phone call makers, and texters, and so much more. Each of these acts is a sacred act, testimony to our belief that God created us as partners in the work of preserving and protecting human dignity and worth. In Texas, we are fortunate to be able to rely on Texas Impact to give us the information and resources we need to do this work together as faith communities united for free and fair elections.
This week's episode of Weekly Witness was brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas and the COVID Collaborative.
I am excited to welcome to the program today Christina Das. Christina is an attorney for the Prepared to Vote and Voting Rights Defender Project with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Christina, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Scott. So excited to be here. Good morning.
And we're going to talk about one of my favorite regions of Texas, East Texas. But before we get to that, I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself and the Legal Defense Fund to folks. So for those who aren't familiar, tell us a bit about the history of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. And I'm curious, tell us some about your role there and what about your job you're most excited about.
Absolutely. Well, my job keeps me on my toes, so there'll be a lot that's exciting.
Nice.
But LDF, the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, we call it LDF because it is separate from the NAACP, your neighborhood chapters or your community organization. LDF traces its origins to the legal department of the NAACP, created by the famous Charles Hamilton Houston in the 1930s. But Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall founded LDF as a separate legal entity in 1940. And since then, we really are America's most storied legal organization fighting for civil rights, racial justice, and human rights. And it's a really dynamic place to be because we use litigation, advocacy, and public education to, eliminate disparities, expand democracy, and my favorite, achieve the racial justice and fulfill the promise of equality for all Americans. It's a lofty goal, but we use a multifaceted approach to do it and make sure that we are working in line with Thurgood Marshall's promises and his goals. And within that, my work is housed within the Thurgood Marshall Institute. So the Voting Rights Defender Project, it's a think tank within the Thurgood Marshall Institute. We work day to day engaging voters all year round, equipping them with information needed to protect their rights, support and expand Black and Brown political participation, and make sure that we have on-the-ground advocacy and public education campaigns to fight back against attempts to restrict our right to vote. It's an all-year effort, and it takes us to the power of bottom-up organizing to make sure that we're in the courts, in the legislature, and in classrooms. So that's a little bit about what we do.
Yeah. So one of the things that I know faith folks always love to ask is the why question. And I'm curious, that's a really impressive organization. That's really impressive work. If I can get a little personal with you for a second, why'd you choose to do this work?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I love talking about the personal. So, I think that it's important to love what you do. And I definitely do that. I get up every day and I'm excited about protecting the right to vote. To me, it's the foundation of all other rights. And it hits home for me because I'm a first-generation immigrant. I help my parents with this process. They are naturalized citizens. And I come from a community, I'm South Asian, that is not highly represented in this area being in civil rights, voting rights, both in terms of representation as well as our rights being protected, right? So whenever you are not part of mainline society, or you're an immigrant, or you are maybe look different or sound different, English isn't your first language, you tend to have a harder time breaking down those barriers to participation. So I find a lot of joy in helping people find their voice and getting to vote, making sure that they feel like an active participant in our democracy, that they have the right to participate and make sure that their opinion is represented in our representative democracy. And for me, there's just no other more important right? So I care deeply about criminal justice, social justice, and equity as a whole. But again, voting is the foundation of all of that. And I really hope that we can move towards a place of universal suffrage where we can work that, voting is fast and easy and free. It's not a burden to others, and it's not something that we are wielding as power over others, right? So it's the only way that we can truly fulfill, again, that promise of racial justice in America. So it's deeply personal to me. I'm very involved in my community with civic organizations, voting rights groups. And I'm calling in from New York today, but New York has very, very bad voting laws as well. So we're working deeply to change those as well. And it's something that I've been involved in for the past 10 years.
Well, Christina, really appreciate your work, and thanks for sharing that. So I know, just based on our work over the course of the last 2 years, that the NAACP opposed voter suppression efforts in Texas, like many of our partner organizations. But I also know that you all are in active litigation around Senate Bill 1, so I don't want to get you in trouble. There are some things you're not going to be able to say. But is there anything you can say about Texas's efforts to suppress minority votes in the last year and how it will impact 2022 elections?
Sure. Thanks for that question. It is super important that those listeners today know about Senate Bill 1, which passed both houses of the Texas legislature and was signed into law on September 7th and was effective from December 2nd. For everyone listening, you know that Election Day is coming up. Early voting starts on February 14th, and this is the first statewide election with SB 1 in effect. SB 1 is an omnibus bill or package of bills, meaning a group of bills that we see a lot of problematic barriers to voting in Texas. Predominantly, it sets, more powers and less accountability for partisan poll watchers. Watchers are those that go into the polling place, work for a campaign or a political party. They're free to roam freely around polling locations, and elections officials are subject to a Class A misdemeanor for knowingly obstructing a poll watcher's view. We just think this could cause issues for voter intimidation and for, again, that free and fair election, and making sure that individuals are not facing any type of intimidation in the polling place or chilling their ability to vote freely. Voters are acutely aware that there are new ID requirements for their vote by mail applications and carrier envelopes. We have been seeing across the state record numbers of rejections for vote by mail applications. You hear it in the news. I'm sure if you're in Texas, you're seeing it on your local TV or your radio. You're hearing about thousands of rejections in Harris County, Bexar County, Travis County. And this is due to the new stringent requirements for vote by mail IDs to have a consistent ID number from the first time you registered all the way to your vote by mail application to that ballot. Important to know, though, I'm happy to share that the Secretary of State's office did release recent guidance through a press release in which they clarified that individuals should feel free to include both their driver's license number as well as the last four of their social security number to avoid any confusion. Provide as much information as possible. There's no prohibition against male voters providing both numbers on their ballot. I know this is a lot, but it's really important to know that you also don't have to use the same number that you originally registered with. The number just has to be associated with your voter registration record. But it's still a lot for voters that are older, voters, again, that might not be native English speakers to know. It's a lot of changes. Another change that I want to cover is that your counties are prohibited from distributing unsolicited vote by mail applications. So your EA's office is not going to hand you that application like they did before. Your election administrator or your voter registration office might not have them laying out You have to go and affirmatively ask for a printed application or fill one out and put it in the mail and make sure it gets to the elections administrator office in your county. And know that if you drive a friend, a neighbor, or a family member, drivers of 7 or more curbside voters must fill out a new form. So it's 7 or more, right? Simultaneously. If you're driving 6 other people, you're fine. If you're driving 7 family members, you're fine. You don't need to fill out a new form. But know that if you're driving 7 or more simultaneously, then you need to fill out new paperwork. And all of that is really important. We want people to not be scared about their rights. We want people to not get into any trouble. So it's a lot to navigate, but we're trying our best to do voter education across East and Central Texas to make sure people are aware of these changes. And that's just a few that I wanted to cover today.
Yeah, so Josh Houston will love this part of the program. He would geek out with you on Senate Bill 1 talk. But you mentioned East Texas, which I have a special place in my heart for. That is a region of Texas that you have a special interest in 2022 and beyond. So let's start with, why are you focusing on East Texas?
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to the top of the call where you asked me what we're doing. So I'm really excited about being in East Texas. LDF has been in Texas for a few years now doing election protection work. And for those that don't know what election protection is, just to break it down, it's really centered on ensuring that all voters have an equal opportunity to participate. Our work is national, but focused on states like Texas and the South that were previously covered under the Voting Rights Act pre-clearance coverage. So in this cycle, I'm really excited that we're going to have a robust program of nonpartisan election protection staff, both volunteer as well as myself and our team, coming to work year-round again to advance and defend the right to vote. We're going to be involved in hyper-local and municipal elections. Last cycle, we were in Harris County for school board elections. And this cycle, we're focusing on the more suburban and rural communities of East Texas that traditionally don't get that national attention. They don't have all of these civic groups or maybe local groups that work on voting participation. And what we're going to do is host a series of trainings to educate everyday Americans about their right to vote, about what their rights are at the ballot box, how far from the ballot box from the polling place individuals can be to electioneer, whether or not polling places are meeting ADA accessibility. Basically, you train them with a checklist to go through to make sure poll sites are operating efficiently, legally, opening on time, closing on time, that there's language access. And we train them to be democracy defenders. So they're going to go out into their own community that they know best, monitor the polls, report back to us, and let us know so we can create a legal and a legislative record for future advocacy, because we know there's a lot of work to be done in East Texas, and specifically in areas that are transportation deserts, areas that have sparse polling locations, areas that have majority populations that are Black or Latinx. We really think that it's pertinent that LDF have a presence in East Texas, but we will be working statewide as well with our partners at the Texas Civil Rights Project and the Lawyers Committee, the League of Women Voters. But we decided to move out of the urban areas and more into East Texas. And specifically, I'm excited to say we'll be working in Galveston, McLennan, Waller, Jefferson, Bowie, Belle, several counties. So if you want to get involved, definitely look us up, look up our efforts, and I can provide a link as well to get involved. We will be on the ground for early voting as well as Election Day.
Yeah, if you'll send us that link, we'll make sure we get it out on Texas Impact's social media. But for listeners in East Texas specifically, and especially in some of the counties you named and will be listed in that link, what do you hope that they'll do? What's the next step besides just going to the link? What do you hope they'll do?
So what does election protection look like practically, right? So it might be a large term, but the work that individuals can do will range from amplifying their neighbors to care about election protection voting rights, making sure people know that Texas does have expansive early voting. Hours range from week to week, but you'll be, I'm looking at my older church ladies, teachers, everybody. You can get involved and be a field captain or a command center lead. This can be virtual or in person, where you will start it in the morning at like 6:30 or in the evening at 6:30 and go to precincts and kind of roving monitors. They go 15 minutes per poll site. They check that poll site checklist to make sure that there's not undue delay. Are there long wait times? You're going to check with your eyes and ears to make sure that you're not hearing of upset voters coming that weren't able to vote. You're going to see if the accessible parking is plenty, if there's enough. You're going to check on curbside voting. Is there a bell? Is there signage? Is someone running back and forth to the election precinct and to the curbside voting place? Or are people waiting a long time? This is important because there's a lot of confusion right now around drive-through voting and curbside voting. There's no more drive-through voting, right? Since SB 1. But there is curbside voting, and that is your legal right. So our volunteers are going to be crucial to make sure that there's not long lines, that people are getting their ballots and in a timely fashion. You also will be crucial in informing voters that are coming towards the polling place. We have a Know Your Rights card that our volunteers will be passing out that has a QR code on it, simple information about SB 1 and your rights. We're happy that we're partnering with Texas Impact on that, trying to get that out to the faith communities. And really, it's about answering questions because, you don't have to be an expert in voting rights to help your neighbors and to kind of break down these laws, know their rights. There's a lot going on. If someone is assisting an elderly family member and they're confused about their role, it's your responsibility as a nonpartisan election monitor, and we'll train you to do this responsibility to inform that assister that they have to fill out paperwork about what they can assist that elderly grandmother or neighbor about. There's additional requirements through SB 1. We're going to train you. There's no experience necessary, and you're going to be in direct communication with us during election day to make sure that, you get the right information and we help where needed. And it's important to know that every Texan should get involved, right? No matter your political views, your party, your age, your sex, your background, your religion, the work of democracy takes all of us educating our friends, family, and, faith neighbors. So it's extremely important. And again, it's fun.
It is fun. And I had a chance to serve as a monitor last election season, and we'll plan on doing it again here in one of your East Texas counties. But we've talked about kind of a special emphasis on East Texas, but this is true throughout the state, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So primary elections, we're recording this on Wednesday, February 9th, and primary elections are starting next week. Early voting starts Monday. So is it too late to make an impact in the primaries, or at this point should we be focused on November? What's your guidance there?
Absolutely not, Scott. We have so much to do for the primaries. As we said, early voting starts next Monday, goes to the 25th, with the exception of President's Day on the 21st. You can get involved today. So we're going to share links for trainings. You're going to be able to be involved on the phones, on your computers, in person. And Election Day is not till March 1st. You have the opportunity to bring this information or bring some information about voting to your workplace, to your neighborhood, to your community. It's definitely not too late to get out there and vote and to get involved in this election protection process. And it's important to know that the process of protecting and securing the vote doesn't end on Election Day. In Texas, we have ballot curing. We have the ability to cure for those that have submitted provisional ballots. Maybe they didn't have the right ID on hand. Or there's vote by mail curing as well if there was an error on your vote by mail ballot. So it's important to know that ballot boards and signature verification committees will be meeting pursuant to the law 6 days until 6 days after Election Day. So you have till March 7th to get involved. I suggest people, if you want to be a partisan poll watcher, fill out that Social Secretary of State training and that oath today. Do it today. Make sure you're able to get into that polling place. You're going to need a new oath now. You're going to need to complete an hour-long training. Do it today. You can do it after work or before work. And that gives you the extra peace of mind that you can go into the polling place. You could be a nonpartisan monitor with LDF or with the Texas Civil Rights Project or the Lawyers Committee and monitor safely from the comfort of your car or bike. Or you could be just an everyday American doing their part by voting and bringing 2 or 3 neighbors to go vote. Give someone a ride. As long as it's less than 7 people, you're fine. You don't need to fill out any paperwork. And you're really protecting democracy by helping someone that might not have a ride get to the polls. So there's a lot you could do.
There is a lot you can do, and we hope that you'll make that commitment today. I said at the top of the program that 95% of Texas elections are typically decided in the primaries. And so it's really, especially a a year after redistricting. So it's especially important that we get engaged in this election. But also, there are some of you, so make that commitment today. But I also hope you'll spend time, like democracy doesn't end at the end of the primary elections. If it's going to take you longer to recruit some friends or get your congregation involved, go ahead and start doing that work today for the next election and the next one after that. This is going to continue to be something we're asking for. If you need more time to plan, go ahead and start that planning process for the next election today. So, Christina, in your LinkedIn profile, you refer to voting rights as the crown jewel of our democracy. So how do you convince voters of color and other vulnerable Americans that their vote truly is valued and part of a valuable system in the face of such widespread conflict around elections?
It's a heavy question. It's a lot, right? That's why I said my job is exciting, but also it's a lot. Voting absolutely is the crown jewel of our democracy, right? It is the Voting Rights Act, in fact, is of 1965 is referred as the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. Due to the landmark legislation that it created. And the work that we do really is volunteer driven. It relies on us leaning on community stakeholders. We make sure we give individuals agency to be involved in this process. We make sure that we tap into existing structures, whether that be in the faith community with your local NAACP chapters, colleges, HBCUs, community groups. We don't have to convince a lot of people that in marginalized communities and vulnerable communities that their vote matters. We just have to convince them to trust that, things will change. And like you said, that the work of democracy doesn't end, right? It's not linear. It's a circle. It keeps going. It might not, happen in our lifetimes, but we will achieve equity and justice, and it's going to happen. So, we're constantly seeing disappointments, whether that be from our courts, our Supreme Court, our federal courts, our local courts, from our legislature that failed to pass federal voting rights protections. We're seeing an onslaught of bills across the country, limiting the powers of elections administrators, making it so that these, civil servants have a harder time doing their job, that voters have a harder time accessing the ballot box. But people still have hope, and that's a powerful thing. We still have the ability to garner a whole new generation of young people. That's how I got involved. To say I've been doing this for 10 years. I got involved when I was 19 on a campaign, and I've been involved since. Yeah. So, we have the future to rely on. We have the energy of organizing. We have a lot of passionate new candidates for running for office. We have people getting involved all the way to their most local levels of government. So what we do is really tap into that all year round and make sure people have the resources that they need to really build political and social power so that they can get involved and dismantle barriers to the ballot box. So we plan on being involved, like Scott said, in March, in May for the runoff, in November for the general, and then you're going to hear from me again next year when it's a legislative session. So,
right.
Yeah, so it's going to take a multi-tiered effort around our elections, around our legislature, in our classrooms, and in our courts. So that's what we do. And we have a lot of powerful community leaders that we lean on to inspire and make sure that we're building grassroots power.
Yeah. So speaking of the legislative session, and we're close to wrapping up, but one of the things we talk to our members about often is that the best time to build a relationship with your representative is not once the session starts, right? It's during campaign season. It's during the interim leading up to the session. So our hope is that our members and listeners are meeting with candidates right now, meeting with the representatives. While they're having those conversations, is there something that you hope that they'll be talking to them about now?
Yes, absolutely. I hope that you all that are listening are talking to your legislatures or candidates or legislators about having online voter registration in Texas, right? We just had a massive storm. Scott in Huntsville and other people all over Texas were impacted, right? And we also have a paper shortage in Texas. This is, I know, hard to believe for many, but it's happening. We're seeing record low numbers of voter registration applications available by the Secretary of State's office. We're seeing people struggling to get paper applications. I don't know about you, but my family members don't all use smartphones all the time. People need paper as well as computers to go online and be able to register safely from their home. And we need to push for this. There's been a bill for the past, I think, 10 years introduced about online voter registration. So let's make it happen, Texas. I think you need to talk to your representatives about this. And 42 states have online voter registration. Why not Texas? So let's make it happen. It's 2022 and we're all on our smartphones. So we need that now.
Yeah, definitely common sense, and we'll continue to push for that. But yes, good thing to be talking to your representatives about now. Christina, love this conversation. Thank you so much for your energy and for your work. I wonder if you have any shameless plugs you'd like to leave us with today.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that it is just crucial for you all, no matter what capacity you have, to get involved in this movement. We are at a pivotal time in our history. And, you're going to be talking to your kids and your grandkids about this, just like people talked about the civil rights movement. The fight is going to be long. It's going to be hard, but we need every single American to get involved and to at least bring one or two people to the polling booth. We need you to get involved with election protection efforts, get involved with Texas Impact, get involved with LDF, and just encourage your neighbors to be civically engaged, because now is the time to step up. I would love for you all to sign up for a training. I'm going to give Scott the link, but it is bit.ly /TX volunteers. And that will lead you right to our volunteer sign up page. You can have an hour and 15-minute training with us, no experience needed. And we will make sure you have the tools in your toolkit to be a nonpartisan election monitor. And we really need you. If you're living in Belle, Bowie, Chambers, Galveston, Jefferson, McLennan, which is in Central Texas, I know, Smith, Waller, and Walker, we really need you to get involved now. And we're going to need you again in May and in December, and again for the legislative session. So tell a neighbor, tell a friend, because we have a lot of work to do.
Tell a neighbor, tell a friend. Friends, we've got a challenge. Let's step up and make that happen over the course of the next few weeks. Christina, thank you so much for the time today, and thanks for your work. Appreciate it. Now I'm excited to welcome to the program Elizabeth Bille, Texas Director of Civic Engagement with the NALEO Education Fund. First of all, Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Scott. Thank you so much for having me.
Looking forward to the conversation, but I want to start today because many of our listeners won't be familiar with NALEO and the NALEO Education Fund. So can you start by telling us what NALEO stands for and tell us a little bit about your work?
Sure. So NALEO really stands for the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials. We have two kind of organizations that we work under. NALEO Educational Fund works to really help provide nonpartisan information to our communities, from naturalization, citizenship, and all things related to voter engagement and voter protection and election. And then we have our sister organization, NALEO, who works with our appointed and elected officials to make sure they're providing with resources to make them better stewards as they go in to become an elected official, or if they are an elected official, that they can have the resources available for them to become just phenomenal elected officials in the regions that they serve.
We really appreciate that work. So earlier in the program, we talked with Christina about the NAACP's long history of voting rights work. And many of our listeners will be familiar with that history. But Latino voting rights might not be as well known. So can you talk to us about Latino voting rights and the history of that movement?
Sure. I could speak more specifically. I will say they go hand in hand with the work, that Christina and the NAACP have been doing for years and decades. We can tell you NALEO as an organization has been since the 1980s, in the 1981. And our goal, as I mentioned, right, is really to provide access to, this work that we've been doing is to create, civic engagement, education and information across the nation. And to make sure that our communities are informed and have the resources available to them. And so we know that a lot of that process starts when we have legal permanent residents that want to become citizen, and they need to find a trusted legal service provider. And that's when we've, as an organization, have been making sure that our community has resources that we can connect them to, a local non-legal nonprofit service provider that can help them with the process, either at low or to no cost. And then from there, right, as they go through that process of naturalization, that they can also then become registered voters. And in that process, provide them with additional resources as to where's my polling location, where can I get access to a voter guide, or just basic information in terms of where they need to go vote. That we're here to provide all those services. I will say another area that we as an organization have also focused is the Decennial Census. We are a key and one of the biggest national organizations to be able to provide information, work directly with the Bureau to make sure that we were providing accurate information to our community and all communities of color. I will say that we all know, if we've been following anything through the last Decennial Census, it looked very different than what we all imagined. And so for us was to make sure that we worked hand in hand with our partners across the nation, but for me, obviously across the state, to make sure that all of our communities of color had resources. Obviously, we wanted to make sure those were provided to the Latino community specifically, but we wanted to make sure that everybody had access and the resources to know how to get themselves counted. And knowing that, that works translates, as I mentioned, right? Whether it's naturalization, whether it's election related, we want to make sure that our communities have accurate information at all times. As we know, we're living in an era where there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation happening, and we're doing a lot of that ourselves to make sure we're combating some of that information that's happening, whether it's digitally or another means.
So I'm interested about NALEO as an organization because you mentioned that you all work specifically with elected officials. So I wonder if that gives you a unique perspective on civic engagement.
It does. I think the fact that we're able to work hand in hand when there's a particular issue, whether it's at the federal level or at the, whether it's county and or state level, that we can work with our members and really either gain from them what's happening at the local level. If there's any policy legislation that's happening that we can work, we have a phenomenal policy and research and advocacy department that I personally work hand in hand, obviously, to make sure that if there's any issues that are happening on the ground, that we're able to work, whether it is directly with our membership or our elected officials that are doing this work.
So there's been a lot of conversation in the national narrative and the Texas narrative over the course of the last few months and years about Latino participation in democracy. And I think our listeners, for sure, Texans of Faith, share that goal of full participation of Latinos in civic life. And you mentioned your work in research and advocacy. I wonder how or if legislative efforts harmed that goal in the last year. Specifically, here in Texas, we've been talking a lot about Senate Bill 1. So did Senate Bill 1, did any of those legislative efforts have an impact on Texas Latinos?
I think it provides confusion. With so many changes happening in such a short turnaround, there's not enough turnaround for all of the civic engagement organizations that are doing phenomenal work, including ours across the state, to kind of go around and be able to address. As we know, in the last few weeks, and as Christina and maybe others have referenced, there's a slew of issues that we've seen kind of as a fallout of SB 1. And we want to make sure that we're there to answer those questions, right? If there's any questions around, the updated voter registration form, if the vote by mail application, that we're there to answer those questions. And that our communities also know, right, that there's that language accessibility. And with our community, we know, we have a tremendous amount of English speakers, but we also know that through Spanish engagement, we also have a lot of, communities that still need that accessibility. And we want to make sure that we provide those resources and let them know this is the steps that you need to do. If you get a letter from your local county election administrator and or clerk, what are the steps that you need to do? Do you know that you need to respond within 15 or 30 days? Whatever the case may be, how we can be a resource to them so that they can get the process moving. And of course, make sure that they don't miss those deadlines when it comes to the registration deadline, when it comes to the early voting period, and obviously our election day.
And we were talking about it a little bit as some friends and I recently. It's hard to message this now, right? Because we spent the last year talking about voter suppression efforts, but now that we're coming up to an election, we need to be doubling down on our efforts to make sure that people are paying attention, that people are doing this work. And that makes conversations like you're having right now, like even more important, right?
Correct. Right. It's a lot of providing, as you mentioned, the clarification part of it all. There was already a lot of questions that came prior to SB1. And so now we have these added layers that we need to include and kind of clarify more than anything. We know we have phenomenal media partners across the state that are kind of just mentioning what's happening, but sometimes there's not necessarily kind of the resources that go with who can you contact to remedy or to fix your voter registration card, or how do you go on to maybe the Secretary of State's website and change that immediately versus actually if you're a first-time voter, you cannot register to vote online. You still have to do the paper form. So it's a whole bunch of information that we kind of have to consolidate and make it easy for our communities to understand and digest in a short period of time as well.
Right. So how can listeners help further the goal of full participation for Latinos in democracy in the next year?
I will say, something that we're very proud of as an organization, NALEO Education Fund, is we run a bilingual hotline. And this bilingual hotline is not just only during big election season. We have staff, hotline operators that are trained, specifically Texas trained, because we've been making sure that they're aware of any kind of issues that are happening, but they answer questions across all 50 states. They're trained to help any member of our community to assess them, whether it's on national station if they want to start the process, questions around census if they had any, and then obviously last but not least, anything related to election that could help them from finding a voter registration form, where do they need to file it, all the way to election protection. The NALEO Education Fund hotline runs from Monday to Friday, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And then during any election, we are part of the election protection umbrella. So we work with the National Lawyers Committee and others to make sure that our communities have access to the polls on election day and obviously through early voting. So I will say that shameless plug, I'm going to give it. Our number is 888-839-8682. And we're happy to be of service. We want to make sure that you call us. We want to make sure that you feel empowered, that you have the resources that you need to make sure you feel empowered to go out to vote.
All right, Elizabeth, anything else you'd leave us with today? Nice job getting your shameless plug in. Anything else?
Yes, besides that one, I would like to say it in Spanish if I can. Me encantaría que los miembros de nuestra comunidad sepan, nuestros tejanos, que aquí estamos. El Fondo Educativo de NALEO es una organización no lucrativa que queremos ayudar a nuestra comunidad a que participen en la participación cívica. Y eso empieza con empezarse a registrarse a votar, a ir a votar en las elecciones, y que estamos aquí, nuestra línea bilingüe está disponible para poderle ayudar con este proceso, sea el proceso de la ciudadanía, sea el proceso de las elecciones. Nosotros le podemos dar toda esa información no partidaria, y el número es 888-839-8682. Nuestra página de internet también es naleo.org. Y si quieren más información, llámenos a nuestra línea bilingüe y estamos ahí para servirles.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. And I hope our listeners will go check out NALEO for more information and share that with your community so we can all make sure we're getting the resources into the hands of communities that need it. Elizabeth, thank you so much for the time today, and thanks for the work you're doing every day.
Thank you so much for having me here. It was a pleasure.
Keep us posted on how we can support your work. Really look forward to future conversations. I want to thank our guests today, Rabbi Nancy Kasten, Christina Das, and Elizabeth Bille. But I especially want to thank you for tuning in, and I hope this episode motivated us. We only have a few days to learn who's running for office, where they stand, who you support and how, and who you can drag to the polls with you. Let's be honest, y'all. Most people aren't paying attention to primary elections, and very few people will vote in them. So just by listening to this podcast, you are more up to date than most of the people you interact with. So I hope you'll take this as a personal challenge to do your homework and to talk to your friends, and then encourage them to come vote with you. By the time you listen to this podcast, Election Day might be upon us, or at least it's close. The time to act is now. And with that, it's time to draw this episode to a close. If you've stayed with us this long, you must have enjoyed the content. So I hope you'll share it with your friends and congregations and leave us a rating or review. That way, even more of your friends can find us and join in the movement for justice in Texas. Also, remember to keep an eye on Texas Impact social media for upcoming announcements, or email me at scott@texasimpact.org with questions. And remember, if you appreciate Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregation are members of Texas Impact by going to texasimpact.org. Friends, these are unprecedented times, and 2022 is an important year for democracy. More than ever, the world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is a production of Texas Impact, engineered and produced by David Vassallo.